Okay, hi everybody. This is Daniel Korobkin speaking to you for WebYeshiva.org. I'm here in Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit, and we are studying Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Emunot Videot, what we would call the first book on Jewish philosophy. Where are we in our book? We are in chapter 1 of the first essay, of the first ma'amar, of the first treatise, as Rosenblatt calls it. This is not the beginning of the book, however, if you're just coming in for the first time. We've done a lot of introductory material. The Rabbi Saadia has a full hakdama, a full introduction, and then there is an introduction to the first treatise, which we did last time. And Rabbi Saadia told us that it is very important, the theme of this first treatise, the first essay, is the topic of creation, that it is important for us to verify using philosophical methodology that which the Torah teaches us, that in the beginning God created heaven and earth, and that creation was creatio ex nihilo, was completely from absolute nothingness. At the end of his introduction to this treatise, Rabbi Saadia had told us that he wants us to remember three things. Namely, and this is, I'm just reading from the Rosenblatt edition on page 40 of his book, which in the translated is Saadia Gaon, the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, and that number one, that your proofs are stronger than those of the others, meaning that even though there are other models that are portrayed using philosophical argumentation as to cosmogony, as to the origins of our universe other than creation by God, your arguments are stronger. Number two, you are able to refute any of their arguments against creation. And number three, that scripture, the words of the prophets, bolsters your argument because you are standing on the shoulders of the authority of the divine word. Okay, so with that in mind, Rabbi Saadia is now going to present to us four logical proofs using the philosophical methodology of his time and the philosophical premises that he's working with in order to prove that indeed the world was created in time. So that's his goal. I'm going to share my screen because I have a full outline today. There's a lot of material for us to cover. And I want us to have what I call like a little sidebar introduction to terms and concepts that those of you who studied with us the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, may be somewhat familiar with, the worldview that Rabbi Saadia is bringing with him. And it's really only understandable, the text that Rabbi Saadia presents us with, if we understand the premises in the scientific or philosophical world in which he was living. So let's just go through a few points, and we're going to see some more on the way, I promise. So first of all, the Earth, our terrestrial realm, is the center of the universe. That's what Rabbi Saadia is working with. That certainly was the worldview until the Copernican revolution, Galileo, not until the 1600s, 1700s, many, many years later, it would be proven that the Earth revolves around the sun. Here, the sun and all of the cosmos revolves around the Earth. The cosmic realm, furthermore, is comprised of stars and planets, but that all the material contained in the cosmos is made up of a completely different matter from the matter we encounter in our terrestrial realm. And the reason why that's relevant is because you're going to see Saadia over and over discussing one proof for establishing what the earth is and one proof establishing what the heavens is. It's because he looks at the earth and the heavens as part of the physical reality that we experience, but they're very different in their material, in their material makeup, even though they're both material existences or realities, but the matter that makes up the heavens is different from the matter that makes up the earth. And we had seen that in the Rambam as well. Rabbi Saadia understands, like others, that when the Torah states that God created heaven and earth, it is descriptive of two different realms that exist within our material reality, where the matter of each realm is different from the other. It's also unclear from Rabbi Saadia whether he understands that the earth is a sphere. We're not sure, at least at this point. I have no indication whether he knows that the world is flat or whether he knows that the world is round. But we'll see if that's relevant. I don't think it's really going to be relevant from our discussion today. Number four, every physical body has a force that drives it and imbues the body with its characteristics. I don't believe that he's necessarily describing the Aristotelian duality of matter and form, but he does talk about a force that is imbued within the earth and a force that's imbued within the heavens. And finally, Rabbi Sadia works with the classic four elements: earth, wind, fire, and water, what are known as Empedocles elements. Earth is the heaviest of the elements. Then water, earth and water are considered to be the heavier elements because they rest on the ground. And wind or air and then fire are the lighter elements, and that's why they hover above us in the sky. The belief was that above our atmosphere there is a layer of fire that is the source of all heat, not with the realization that the sun is projecting all of that heat upon us. Okay, so there are other premises that Reb Sadia is working with. We didn't even get into the celestial spheres and the Ptolemaic planetary system, which have been discussed before when we studied the Mora Nevuchim together, but I believe that we will get into that at some point later on. I just want us to know what we need to have a working understanding of as far as what Reb Sadia's worldview is for now, and then we'll talk about other things that we need to know later on. And I'm going to introduce certain ideas that Rabbi Sadia subscribed to that the Rambam disagreed with. We're going to get to that shortly. But let's go first through the first proof first. The first proof Rabbi Sadia is going to get is basically telling us that I have a number of proofs to present, but these four proofs, I feel, says Rabbi Sadia, are probably the most important, at least for now, for us to know. Proof number one, the finiteness of everything we encounter demonstrates creation. And what we mean by finiteness is that nothing that we encounter in our world is boundless. Everything is bounded. Everything has a finite size and dimension. Even our huge planet that we live on, the planet Earth, must be finite in size. Everybody that we perceive is finite in size and dimension. This is proven by the fact that the heavens revolve around the earth. The earth must therefore be finite in size, otherwise nothing could revolve around it. Could you imagine an infinitely long planet Earth that no matter how far east and how far west you look and how far north and how far south, it goes on until infinity? It says if that were the case, then nothing could revolve around our earth. And yet we know that the sun and the moon and the stars are constantly revolving around our planet. So it must be that it's not finite, it's not infinite in its span, in its dimension. Because the bodies themselves are finite, the forces behind them must also be finite. And if the forces behind them are finite, as we'll see, then everything must have had a beginning and an end. We'll get to that in just a moment. I also was able to prove to myself that not only is the earth finite, but so are the heavens. This is demonstrated because the heavens move in a revolving motion around the earth, and something infinite in size could not move around something else. If the heavens themselves, just the totality of the heavens, which contain the sun, the moon, and the stars, was infinite in span, it couldn't all move around the planet because something infinite in size cannot move around anything else. It's too large. Okay? Perhaps you will argue that in reality the heavens are infinite, but only the surface crust or the visible part of the heavens closest to us revolves around us, while the rest of the infinite heavens remain stationary. I mean, perhaps he's anticipating. Maybe it's just our solar system and the rest of the universe is infinite. Although, of course, he doesn't know from solar systems yet, but he's suggesting that maybe the heavens are comprised of two different parts. One is the finite part that we see that moves around us, and the other part of the heavens, which is the extended heavens, is infinite and goes on ad infinitum. He says this, however, is not logical thinking. To conceive of something that we call heaven, which does not at all share the characteristics of what we observe with our senses. And remember, Rabbi Sadia is living in the world of inductive reasoning, where I observe something and I come to a conclusion based on my observation. It would make no sense for us to imagine something that exists that we've never observed and we've never gauged. And so therefore, based on our own observations, we have to conclude that not only is our terrestrial realm finite in its size, so too is the heavenly sphere, the heavenly realm, also finite in size. And so then Reb Sages, I then considered the following. Although we must submit that our earth and heavens are finite in time, there may be a different, so basically his argument is anything that is finite in size must also be finite in time. Anything that is bounded by space is also bounded by time. And it's a reasonable premise, because if something is constrained in space, logically it would make sense to say that it's bounded, because any force that is bounded by space must have limited ability, or must have limited ability to imbue whatever it is sustaining. And so therefore it must have a beginning and an end as well. Then Rav Sadia says, okay, so that's the first proof. I then considered the following. Although we must submit that our earth and heavens are finite in time, there may be a different infinitude in that there are an infinite number of earths and an infinite number of heavens coexisting. Could that be possible? In other words, what we're going to be seeing throughout this discussion is that Reb Sadia is contemplating the concept of infinity. And infinity is a concept that you need to accept if you believe that the world was not created in time, as Aristotle believed. He believed that the universe as it exists presently has always existed ad infinitum, going back all the way to time immemorial. There is no beginning of anything. There's no beginning of time, and there's no beginning of space. And Rabbi Sadia says the concept of infinity is not something, and we'll see more of this in his fourth and final proof, the concept of infinity is demonstrated to not be the case in our bounded physical world, our bounded physical reality. But could it not be argued that even though everything that we experience is finite and bounded, but maybe there's an infinite number of those things that are finite and bounded, so that we still end up with something that is infinite in our frame of existence. Reb Kafich says that this is not an argument against creation. It's just a suggestion that, as a corollary of our discussion about whether the world is finite in time or not, whether it was created or not, even if we have to submit that the world was created, is it possible that there's a different kind of infinity, meaning a coexistent infinity, that there are an infinite number of things that coexist ad infinitum. So this strangely sounds like string theory and the theory of infinite dimensions that we have today, although I assure you it's not related at all. It's just that it sounds like that. I want us to consider that the Rambam maintains that is impossible, that it is impossible to have an infinite string of finite things. This is based on his 26 Aristotelian premises, which he documents in his introduction to part 2 of the guide. The second of the 26 premises is that there cannot be an infinite number of finite objects simultaneously. Later, we will see if Rabbi Sadia agrees with this premise on a logical basis. But here, he's not willing to accept, at least for our purposes of the first argument, of the first proof, he's putting aside all of the philosophical issues about infinite coexistence. For now, he's willing to concede the possibility of infinitude of physical bodies coexisting. So based on that, let's see his argument. I realize, says Reb Sadia, that was impossible, that there cannot be an infinite number of physical bodies coexisting. This is because the science of the elements demands that Earth is always heavier than air. If there were other Earths beyond our heavens, they would have already fallen through the heavens due to their heaviness and landed on Earth. Similarly, if there were oceans attached to those other Earths, their waters, due to their greater heaviness than air and fire, would also have fallen down to our Earth and connected to its waters, the waters of our terrestrial realm. And what you see from here is that Reb Sadia is using, again, a very, very different conception of the universe than from what we have. And that's why this discussion is maybe somewhat disorienting for some of us. Reb Sadia is maintaining that our Earth is the center of the universe. Could there be an infinite number of Earths beyond us? Let's do a thought experiment. He says if that were the case, then the heaviness of those earthy elements, of those planets, would have fallen down, because nothing that is heavier than air can be above air, is essentially what he's arguing. And that's okay. So obviously that's not has nothing to do with modern science. We look at this and we're sort of saying, gee, he's got a really, really different way of looking at the world from us, but that's what he argues. This proves that there is only one finite earth and one finite heaven, resulting in the necessary conclusion that both have finiteness in time as well. Similarly, the underlying forces that give rise to the earth and heavens are also finite. You can't have a force that is infinite imbuing a finite and bounded earth, nor can you have a finite force imbuing and sustaining an infinite earth. I also realized that Scripture bolstered both the arguments of finitude of both earth and heaven and bearing witness that the sun revolves around the earth, which also demonstrates the finitude of size. And he quotes us 3 psukim. These psukim could be taken metaphorically, but Reb Sadia takes them quite literally. In 2 places in the book of Devarim, Hashem talks about the end of one thing to the other end. Miktzei haaretz va'ad kitzei haaretz, from one end of the earth to the other. And he talks about ulamiktzei hashamayim va'ad kitzei hashamayim. Apparently, we see that Scripture bears witness that the earth is bounded. It has from one end to the other. Something that's infinite has no ends. And the same thing is said about the heavens. And finally, it says in Kohelet, in the book of Ecclesiastes, 1st chapter, verse 5, V'zorach hashemesh ubo hashemesh, ve'el mekamo sho'ev zoreach sham, that the sun is constantly making revolutions around our planet, coming back to the place it started. It rises in the east, it sets in the west, and does the same thing over and over again. That certainly proves that the earth and the heavens cannot be infinite in size or dimension, because nothing that is infinite can be revolved around, nor can it revolve around something else. Once we've established finiteness in size, ergo, argues Rabbi Sadia, there must be finiteness in time as well. That's his first proof. Second proof is the atomized components of reality are grouped together. Now, this requires a little bit of unpacking, which we're going to do momentarily. But for now, let me just say that Rabbi Sadia Gaon subscribed to a philosophical worldview that was not Aristotelian. And here we're going to see some major difference of opinion between Rabbi Sadia and the Rambam. And it's actually a good thing. In my opinion, if you really want to get a good grounding in the world where Rabbi Sadia is coming from, even though it's asynchronous, look at the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, which is written over 100 years, really 200 years after Rabbi Sadia, and you'll be able to reflect back on what Rabbi Sadia believed, because the Rambam cites so many of Rabbi Sadia's philosophical beliefs under the category of the Mutakalimun, of the Kalamists that were part of Rabbi Sadia's world in the time when he was living, and the Rambam argues against them. Even though they too undertook the same project as the Rambam, which is to prove that the world was created, which is what so much of the Moreh Nevuchim is devoted to, the same arguments or the same objectives that Rabbi Sadia has. So Rabbi Sadia has a worldview that instead of this dualism that Aristotle talked about, of everything being comprised of matter and form, instead Rabbi Sadia believed that everything in this world is comprised of very, very tiny quanta, or very, very tiny packets of material, which we call today atom. And therefore, the philosophical worldview that subscribes to this, they are called the atomists. And even though that was rejected for a very long period of human history, people rejected the belief of the atomists, it was taken up again when the modern scientific revolution took place in the 18th and 19th centuries, and people started to realize, the ancient atomists were right. The world really is made up of very, very tiny collection of very, very small pieces, which we now call atoms and molecules and cells and so forth. But they were just called atoms in the times of the Greeks. Now, the fact is that if everything is comprised of atoms, and these atoms are steady state, every single atom is the same as every other atom in this worldview, then how is it that some things turn out to be a book if they're made up of atoms, and the very same atoms will coalesce into a cup, and other atoms will coalesce into a human being, and other atoms will coalesce into a flower. How does that happen? So this was one of the great mysteries. And if you're an atomist, you conclude that there must be a being, a supreme being, that assembles the atoms in a particular way. Not that, today we understand that every atom has a certain number of protons and electrons and a certain valence and weight and an electric charge and so forth and so on that causes it to group together with other atoms to make up different elements and so forth. That was not the belief back then. Every atom is made up of the same material. They're very, very small particles that coalesce, and then they develop and acquire certain characteristics. So Reb Sadia says as follows: I observe that this world is comprised of components that are a collection of disparate parts, both those that are homogeneous, such as like a rock, which is made up, just looks like solid rock, and those that are comprised of multiple elements, such as living creatures, which are made up of bone and skin and blood and organs, etc. Anything that is constructed, that is made up of multiple parts, must have a constructor, a builder, a being who put everything here in its current form. This must have occurred at some point in time, because nothing builds itself. Nothing can perpetually be in a built state unless there was a builder that built it at some point in time. That's proof number 2. Do not think that this kind of structure is only manifest in small organisms, such as living creatures and plants. Even the entire earth, made up of dirt, rock, and sand, are also composites of smaller components. So the largest components, the mountains and the oceans, are also comprised of atoms. This structured reality is not only true of the terrestrial realm, but of the heavens as well. We note multiple layers of spheres concentric within each other, which contain bodies such as stars, some smaller and some larger. These too are part of the structuring of the heavens. And just a little sidebar, Rabbi Sadia's belief is that the cosmos, that when we look up at the sky, there are really concentric, transparent spheres that we're looking at, which all revolve at a different velocity and a different speed. And the planets and stars are embedded in those various spheres, which accounts for the different types of orbits that are not synchronous with each other, because there are multiple spheres that are moving around at different speeds and in different directions. That's the way Reb Sadia views what's going on in our universe. And he says, you therefore see that the heavens are also heterogeneous, and they're made up of different elements, and so they must be made up of the same kinds of atoms that the earth is made up, that things in our earth are made up of as well. This indicates that the heavens were created by the being who put all the disparate pieces together, the disparate atoms. This fact that creatures, the earth and the heavens, were constructed from disparate parts by a maker, and that this evidence proves the finitude of creation and time, is borne by scripture. And here again, Reb Sadia brings us 3 psukim, which the first one is from Tehillim, from Psalms. It says, Yadecha asuni vayechonenuni, that it is your hands, O God, that made me and put me together and set me aright. And this indicates what Reb Sadia is trying to set out. Once you concede that everything was put together by a maker, it must have been done at some point in time, which is the second proof for creation. I want to recall that last week we looked at the Ramban's commentary on the Torah, where he tells us that the word bara, bet resh aleph, is the word in Hebrew for kriyatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. The verb asa, ayin sin he, is the verb, and also yud tzadi resh, the formation of both of those describe according to Reb Sadia, putting together the disparate pieces that the maker of the universe does. Okay, the book of Isaiah, chapter 45. Kicho amar Hashem borei hashemayim hu ha'elokim, yotzer ha'aretz va'osa hu chonena. That God, who made the heavens, also forms the earth, and again the verb yatzar, and osa, and makes, hu chonena, he sets it up. And finally in Tehillim chapter 8, when I look upon your heavens, which are the handiwork of your fingers, Yareach v'kolchavim asher konanta, and the moon and the stars which you have set up. So we see that from all of these, that God is the assembler, the great maker, and putter together, the constructor of our reality, and that implies creation. Now, we want to note that the Rambam made note of the atomic theory of creation and rejected it, attributing it to the errant mutakalimun. This is where he takes issue with Reb Saadia. Even though he gives great respect to Reb Saadia when disagreeing with him, he still nonetheless disagrees. We refer you to the Moreh Nevuchim chapter, section 1, chapter 74, where the Rambam lists 7 proofs of the mutakalimun for creation and time and a creator. They were involved in the same project, but their methodology was flawed. It's essentially what the Rambam argues. Proof number 3 of the mutakalimun is atoms are static, uniform substances. The fact that some aggregate and some separate proves that there is a creator who structured them as such at some point in time. And that the Rambam rejects and argues for creation using an Aristotelian worldview, even though Aristotle himself did not accept the concept of creation. And that's really the project of the guide. What we're going to go on to in the Emunot video. Let's continue. So we've seen the first proof, which is the argument for the finiteness of everything, which demonstrates creation. We've seen the second proof now, which is the fact that things that are comprised of atoms are structured in the way that they are, indicates a maker. A maker requires, conceding that there's a maker, also necessitates that the universe was created in time. Proof number 3, that all components of nature are subject to accident, that is, non-essential qualities that are subject to change. Everything in the world that we observe, certainly in our terrestrial realm, is constantly subject to change. We may say that some changes are part of the intrinsic being of the organism, such as plants, which by their nature change through their growth and their maturation. Or we may say that some changes are extrinsic, in that the plant, as for example, as it ages, is broken down by external forces into its baser elements until it disintegrates. Whether the change is intrinsic to the organism or extrinsic, coming from the change coming from the outside, it makes no difference, argues Reb Saadia. The fact is, everything that we experience, at least in our terrestrial realm, is subject to change. Change means that something new occurs to that organism. This implies that newness or coming into being is a natural feature of all organisms. Thus, everything has been created. In other words, the argument is as follows. Once you can trace changes in an organism, you conclude that the organism was created. Because if something is subject to newness in its being, it must be subject to newness in its coming to being. Okay? So that's the argument that Reb Saadia gives. This feature of change, he says, is also manifest in the heavens. Now, you might recall that in our studies of the Moreh Nevuchim, this was not a given. There were philosophers who argued that while things grow older and die in our terrestrial realm, that is not the case in the celestial or the cosmic realm of the heavens. But Reb Saadia says anything that changes must have been created. We note that everything that is in motion is in a constant state of change. Furthermore, the movements of different bodies vary, in that some are faster and some are slower, and even individual bodies change in their speed from time to time. You might, through observation, observe that at one point a star or some other kind of a comet may be moving at a slower pace or at a faster pace at different points along its elliptic or its orbit around our planet. And that indicates change. Anything that is subject to change is subject to coming into being anew. Some bodies illuminate other bodies, like the sun illuminating the moon, which means the moon is in a constant state of luminary change. Some stars are constantly fluctuating in color from red to white to green. The heavens could not exist as we know them without their contents. And so if the contents of the heavens are subject to change, so are the heavens, which means that the heavens too must have been brought into being at some point. And so this is the argument, regardless. So therefore, even though there are some Aristotelian philosophers who believe in the eternity of the cosmos. Nonetheless, Rabbi Sadia says that anything that is subject to change means that it's subject to a newness of being, and that newness of being implies that they are subject to coming into being anew. Okay, Scripture confirms this idea that heaven and earth indicate that we were at one point created. Why? Because it says in Isaiah chapter 45, Anochi asiti eretz, the Adam aleha barati. I made the earth, I created Adam upon it. Ani yadai natu shamayim, v'chol tziva'am tziveti. I spread out the heavens. In other words, this verse indicates that there's change that God is in control of. V'chol tziva'am tziveti, and I gave charge to all of the hosts of the heavens. So this indicates that through the fact that the world is subject to change because God is spreading out and constantly causing change to occur in the heavens, that indicates that they were created. So we just as a sidebar, we note that this is similar to the Rambam's citation of proof number 1 of the Mutakalimun in the guide, chapter 74 that we mentioned above, where I'm just quoting directly from the translation. Some of the Mutakalimun thought that by proving the creation of one thing, they demonstrated the creatio ex nihilo, the idea of creation from nothing, in reference to the entire universe. So, for example, I have a man whose name is Zaid. It's just like a guy in the Arabic world whose name is John, okay, who from a small drop of sperm had gradually been brought to a state of perfection. He started as a zygote, then became an embryo, then became a fetus, then became a newborn baby, then became a teenager, then became an adult. So he goes from a very, very imperfect state to a perfected state of humanity, has undoubtedly not affected this change in development by his own efforts, but owes it to an external agency. It is therefore clear that an agent is required for such organization and successive transmutation. A palm tree or any other object might equally be selected to illustrate this idea. It starts off as a seed and then grows into a sapling and then becomes a full-grown tree. The whole universe, they argue, is analogous to these instances. Thus, you see how they believe that a law discovered in one thing may equally be applied to everything. And I also refer you to proof number 4 of that the Rambam cites of the Mutakalimun that is a little bit more complex and that really fleshes out the argument that Rabbi Sadia is making for his third proof. So the third proof, just to review, is anything that is subject to change, therefore must have been created in time. Argument, fourth and final proof, time cannot be infinite. Now, this is very complex, and I'm just going to try to go through it and simplify it as best as I possibly can. And also, I just want to point out, in looking at the different versions and the different commentaries that I have accessible to me on the guide, I note that there's a wide variety of interpretation of some of the lines of this fourth proof that Reb Sadia is putting forth. So the argument basically is time cannot be infinite. This proof is presented by the Rambam in chapter 73 of the first part of the guide, which is premise number 11. The Rambam lists a whole series of working premises or axioms of the Mutakalimun with whom he's going to disagree. In brief, the Mutakalimun reject 4 types of infinity based on the logical absurdity of infinite things, something which the mind cannot fathom. And this is a very important point, the worldview that Reb Sadia is working with. If we are imbued with an intellect, which is the closest thing to God, that intellect was endowed with the ability to comprehend certain things and also to dismiss as absurd other things that just don't seem to logically be possible, right? If that's the case, then certain things we must reject the prospect of their existence by virtue of the fact that the mind cannot comprehend those ideas. In other words, so great was the investment that the Mutakalimun had in the human mind that they said if the human mind rejects these concepts as absurd, then they must not be true. Now, we know that today that's not at all how science looks at the world. If anything, we say just the opposite, that the mind is a filter to block out certain realities that exist beyond the ability for the mind to compute. no one really can understand properly quantum physics. We just create sort of metaphors to help us understand what this is all about, the subatomic reality. But that was not the worldview of Rabbi Sadia, nor of the Mutakalimun. There are four types of infinity that the Mutakalimun therefore rejected. They rejected the possibility of any physical body being infinite in size. They rejected the possibility of there being an infinite number of finitely measured bodies. So we talked about both of those concepts in the first proof. So the Mutakalimun rejected both of them. Now, is there the possibility of an infinite number of divisions within a body or a time? Could you have an infinite number of points within a mile of road? Could you divide that into an infinite number of divisions? So the Mutakalimun also rejected that. And number four is an infinite sequence of causal things or moments where A begets B, B begets C ad infinitum. Can you have an infinitely long chain going to infinity in time? And that also is something that the Mutakalimun reject. And this is something that Reb Sadia is going to demonstrate or argue in the fourth proof. Nothing can be infinite, including time. Now Aristotle and the Rambam acknowledge that the first two are impossible, but not the last two. Aristotle believed in the possibility of there being an infinitely long chain of causalities going infinitely through, going back to infinity in time. Thus, contrary to the Mutakalimun, an eternal existence in time is possible for Aristotle, even though, according to the Rambam, we must eventually reject it for the Torah narrative of creation. But for Rabbi Sadia, the fourth proof that he's going to provide that the world must have been created in time is that you cannot have an infinite chain of time. Okay, now the fourth infinity is what Rabbi Sadia is arguing against here, and he's going to be arguing using the third argument against infinity, which is an infinite number of divisions within a finite stretch of space. He presents time as being comprised of three parts: past, present, and future. Present time is like a geometric point on a line. It has no dimensions, but connects to the points of time before it, which we call the past, and the points of time after it, which we call the future. The mind cannot fathom an infinite series of points, thus yielding, as the Rambam states, an absurdity. Since you cannot have an infinite sequence of points of time, the present cannot exist. Because how do we get to the present? We can only get to the present by standing on it or accumulating upon an infinite series of points of time that came before us. If you cannot have an infinite chain of infinite points of time that came before us, then the present cannot exist. This means that anything existing in the present also cannot exist. But I, by virtue of my being, realize that I do exist, says Reb Sadia. This means that all the previous present points must have linked together to reach the current present point. If so, an infinity in a sequence of infinite points leading to the present is impossible. Those points of time must be finite in nature. Now, this argument causes us to conclude that just as there cannot be an infinite number of time points in the past, there also cannot be an infinite number of time points in the future. That is to say, our current existence will at some point cease to exist. This is something that Reb Sadia is very strong to argue for, and it's an important point because when we look at Reb Sadia's theology, he believes that just as the world was created, the world will at some point come to an end. Now, there's a lot of Talmudic literature that indicates that our world will only exist for a finite period of time, like the Gemara in Sanhedrin states, Shit Alfei Shana Have Alma, the world will only exist for 6,000 years, and then everything will go back to Tohu Vavohu, to chaos and void. And Reb Sadia could certainly point to that as his support within Judaic literature, but he's arguing from a philosophical point of view. If the universe was created in time and there cannot be an infinite number of points of time, then eventually our current existence will cease to exist. Now, we note that the Rambam opposed this thinking. In a separate part of the guide, in section 2, chapter 28, the Rambam agrees in the impossibility of a parte ante, the Latin term for infinity going backwards in time. But he maintains a belief in a parte post, the term for an infinite amount of time going forward in the future. That in the future is infinite in the Rambam's belief, based on the verse in Ecclesiastes, Dor holech v'dor ba, generations will come and go, but v'haaretz le'olam omedet, but the world will exist forever, ad infinitum. So that's not a discussion for now. Let's just continue with our understanding of Reb Sadia. And I find that Scripture supports this argument, and Rabbi Sadia is going to provide us with two verses from the book of Job that at face value do not really indicate anything about what he's talking about, but he seems to understand that the word merachok, that when the prophet describes being able to see from a distance, going out into the past or into the future, that indicates seeing something merachok from a distance means that there is a beginning and an end to that span of time or space. As it says in Eov in two different places from chapter 36, Kol Adam chazu vo, every man looks upon it, Enosh yabit merachok, mankind looks upon it from a distance. Or Esa dei le merachok, I will lift my knowledge to a distance. A distance means that I cannot fathom something existing infinitely, and because the human mind cannot fathom it, we cannot logically make sense of it. We arrive at an absurdity that the present does not exist, and therefore I don't exist if we concede infinity of time, and therefore we must reject it. Now, Reb Sadia continues this fourth proof, and he says, it's been brought to my attention that one of the heretics met up with a believer and sought to topple this proof. Now, here's where the language becomes somewhat murky in the Hebrew, and I do not have reference right now to be able to verify the Arabic original, but so I'm only going to be working with what to me is the most simple and straightforward explanation of what Rabbi Sadia is saying now. So he says, it's been brought to my attention that a heretic met up with a believer, someone who believes in the unitary existence of God and our creation and so forth, and he sought to topple this proof. He said it is possible for a person to traverse an infinite number of points. Since each point has no dimension, every stretch of distance is made up of an infinite number of points. By walking a mile, you have traversed infinity. That was the argument of the heretic. One thinker responded to this challenge with the theory of atoms. In reality, each point along a mile is made up of a very small quantum of mass. So there really is not an infinite number of points, but rather only a very large, finite number of points that occupy any stretch of finite space. Another response was that in between each atom there is a small gap, such that there is a finite number of atoms in a mile, which would not equate well to time, because you would have to say that there's packets of time and spaces in between those packets of time, which doesn't really equate well with the mind. Still, others argued, and this is Rav Kitover's commentary, that which the Rambam states in the Guide, chapter 73, about the Mutakalimun's observation that different things travel at different speeds. He says, now mark what conclusions were drawn from these three propositions, the first three premises of the Mutakalimun, and were accepted by the Mutakalimun as true. They held that locomotion consisted in the translation of each atom of a body from one point to the next one. Accordingly, any body of mass that travels, the velocity of one body in motion cannot be greater than that of another body, because everything atomically is all equivalent. When we do encounter two bodies that move during the same time through different spaces, the cause of this difference is not attributed by them to the fact that the body which has moved through a larger distance at a greater velocity, but to the circumstance that motion, which in ordinary language is called slow, has been interrupted by more moments of rest, while the motion, which ordinarily is called quick, has been interrupted by fewer moments of rest. And I think essentially what the argument that is being made is that the argument is that there are not an infinite number of points within a mile, within a finite gap of space, but rather if you encounter different velocities and different movements, you must conclude that that different atoms are interrupting other atoms, and that's the reason why we seem to encounter an infinitude of space when really there is not. It's something like that. That's the argument to respond to the heretics. However, Rabbi Sadia says the whole premise of the heretic is erroneous. And he says, my response to this heretic's arguments is different, and that I find his argument misleading. When we say that there are an infinite number of points in 1 mile, we only mean this in theory, but not practically, since on the physical plane, every point must have some mass. But this is where time and space differ. Space is only infinitely divisible conceptually, but not in reality. Infinite time, however, exists even in reality if we are to suggest that the universe has eternally existed. Since it is impossible to comprehend getting from an infinite past to the present, the world must have been created in time. So the refutation of the heretic is very simple, says Reb Sadia. You're bringing me an argument from an infinite number of points in space and trying to apply it to an infinite number of points in time. The two are not analogous. You cannot have an infinite number of points in space, but you could, in theory, have an infinite number of points in time, because every packet of time is equivalent and infinitesimally small. So therefore, you have to reject the concept of infinity of time in order for us to get to the present time, in order for anything to exist. Bottom line is, and this is where Saj is going to conclude, after listing these 4 proofs, I note that I have authored other proofs to the idea of creation from nothing. Some appear in my Torah commentary, and Reb Koch says, sadly, we've lost that to the sands of time. Some appear in my commentary to Sefer Yetzirah. We've talked about before how Rabbi Sadia has a very well-known and accepted commentary on the book of creation, which we're not going to go into now. Some appear in my letters to a man named Chivya HaBalchi, which many of which are lost to us. We don't really know who this person was. Others appear throughout my other writings. What I have written here, however, suffices to fend off my opponents and strengthen one's belief in creation ex nihilo. It is therefore worthwhile to study these proofs and connect them to other ideas like them. So, just to review, and with this we will conclude, Rabbi Sadia has brought us 4 what he calls proofs or arguments for the idea of creation from nothing in time. The first proof is when we encounter finiteness of space, this leads us to conclude finiteness in time. The second proof is that we see that the universe was in some way put together by a maker because of his theory of atoms. And as such, we must conclude that if there is a maker, then he did at one point in time make everything that he made, and that proves creation. The third proof is that all components of nature that we observe are subject to change, and change indicates something new coming into being about that component of nature, and from that we can extrapolate that everything that exists has some newness or coming into being about it, which proves creation. And the fourth and final argument is that time, based on the absurdity of trying to conceptualize an infinite number of infinitesimally small packets of time leading us to the present, is impossible, right? So therefore, time, because time cannot be infinite, there must have been a creation at some point of time and space, and that is the fourth and final proof that Reb Sadia is going to provide us for now. Okay, that concludes our discussion for today. Again, some very foreign concepts, but I hope there's the exercise in itself may be a little bit rigorous or tough going, but at least now we have a better idea where Reb Sadia is coming from, and we'll continue this discussion with Chapter 2, Bezrat Hashem, next week. I'm sorry that we've gone a little bit over time, so if anyone, I noticed this morning in my inbox that one of the attendees of the Shiur was kind enough to send me an email. If anyone would like to make a comment or a question, please feel free to email me at rabbi.korobkin@bayt.ca, at bayit.ca. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you next time.